What's going on, everybody? It's Greg Peters with the Car Passion channel here, and today we're gonna disassemble the cylinder head from the VVT Beast Miata, and we're gonna take 10,000 measurements and learn a whole bunch of stuff. This one is gonna be technical. We're getting down, dirty, and scientific. It's gonna be all about Valvetrain, valve springs, valve seats, valve lash, valve spring, installed height, just whatever you do. Do not invent a drinking game where you take a shot every time I say valve, because by the end of this video, you're not gonna know what planet you're on. Anyways, let's jump into it. All right, we've got a lot of stuff to cover in this video. I'll be disassembling the head from the 400 horsepower turbo Miata. And yes, I know I've been saying that in like every video lately, but you know, it's for anyone who's brand new to the channel. You kind of have a little bit of more of an idea of what I'm doing. You don't have to have watched all the previous videos. In fact, if you are brand new to Car Passion, drop a comment down below. What do you drive? What are you building? Anyways, I'm gonna talk about every part of the Valvetrain and what its job is. We'll take a closer look at the damage. I'll teach you guys how to measure the installed height of a valve and measure the spring stiffness, and talk about what all that even means and why it's important, so I can test out the old springs coming out of the head versus the new ones going in. And yes, all this stuff can be done by a machine shop. You don't really need to know how to do it or buy all these extra tools in order to build your engine or build your head. But for me personally, I enjoy learning what's going on inside the engine with using simple and inexpensive tools, and then teaching all that stuff to people who have similar interests. So between this cylinder head from the turbo car, the head that's on the NB, and the head that I'm building for the NB, there's going to be a ton of data and information collected, but I'm going to take all the information I collect about all the cylinder heads, like the weights of the different parts and specs and clearances and stuff like that, and condense them all down into one page that can be found at thecarpassionchannel.com/headgames. Anyways, let's dive into this thing. So today's video is all about valve seat pressure, or the amount of force that the valve springs apply to the valves when they're closed. See, upgrading your valve springs to a stiffer unit doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have more seat pressure. You can actually have a softer spring that has more valve seat pressure, and you have to look at both specifications when you're upgrading your valve springs. Now, if you don't have enough seat pressure, when the valve goes to close, especially at high RPM and boost, it can actually bounce instead of just closing, and this accelerates the wear on the valve greatly. See, when I built this engine, I just thought to myself, you know, people have made 400 horsepower with stock valve springs, so if I just do a mild upgrade, which are the Volvo VS855 valve springs. I know a lot of people were using these springs even before I did, but I'm sure I popularized them a little bit. But it looks like these springs are just not up to the task for the amount of RPM and boost I'm running with this engine. Even though there are a lot of people making above 400 horsepower with Miata engines nowadays, there are still new discoveries being made by people and companies about things that really should be upgraded to increase the longevity of these engines. When I uploaded my last video showing the damage to the Valvetrain and kind of how I discovered it, many of you guys pointed me in the direction of a video by a shop called SPS Motorsport, and they have been dealing with this issue for a long time on cars that are running 20 plus PSI. And I'll link this video down below so you guys can check it out, but it really points out that it's about more than just spring stiffness, so I figured I should probably buy a bunch of tools and make a video about what I'm finding inside of my head. The first step here is to remove the camshafts. Now you have to loosen up the cam caps in a specific order, in stages. We don't want to end up with a bent cam here, and make sure all of your caps stay in order, and when you put the head back together, they're all facing the same direction they were originally. If you turn the cap around, it will fit, but it won't last very long. Next, remove the lifters, which have the shims on top of them. Now make sure, again, you keep all this stuff in order and the parts are going back where they came from. One thing I want to point out here is, as my intake valves were wearing out, I ended up re-shimming the head to get the valve lash right, and I had to use thinner and thinner shims. Now check out, this is one of the shims on the exhaust side. You can see how far it's sticking out of the lifter, and then look at one of the intake valves that I had to re-shim. The difference in thickness there is how much those valves were moving as they wore out. And as the valves move up into the head more, the installed height becomes greater and the seat pressure of the valve spring becomes lower. That is what today's video is about. Once all the lifters are out, I get to bust out my first brand new tool of the day. Now I'm gonna have all these tools linked down below in the description in case you're doing anything similar. Now there are many different kinds of valve spring compressors. This one, you do have to have the head removed from the vehicle, and it's a little bit of a pain to use compared to the more expensive ones, but this thing is really cheap and it definitely gets the job done. So the kit comes with a bunch of different sizes of these hollow socket looking things. You just have to select the right one that sits on top of the valve spring retainer, and then the other part of the tool will press against the bottom of the valve, and when you crank it down, it's going to compress that valve spring and you'll be able to remove the keepers and the retainer and pull that assembly completely out. Now, even though it doesn't matter where the springs go when you reassemble your head if you're using the same ones, I'm keeping all of these in order, so when I measure them, I can compare them to each valve to see if there's some kind of crazy discrepancy or anything. And even though I'm keeping them in order, I am still being OCD and labeling everything. You know, if we have an earthquake, which is something we need to be concerned with here in California, all these parts could fall off the bench and then I'd be hosed. Oh yeah, and when you're using this tool, just be really careful not to scratch the walls of the area that the lifter goes down into. All right, now I have the entire head disassembled. All the parts are laid out on the bench and labeled. Now I can give you a really good visual on what a worn out valve looks like. So here I have one of my exhaust valves. These valves do not appear to have any wear at all on them. And I have a feeler gauge with an edge on it that's perfectly straight. And when I put it against the valve seat, it just lays flat and it looks like this. Now let me take one of the badly worn intake valves and do the same test. You can see that the valve sealing surface has got some very odd looking wear on it. The metal of the valve is actually going away, and that's why the valve will move up into the head more and your valve lash will continue to close. Now, SPS Motorsport was kind enough to reach out to me and we had a little bit of a conversation about this stuff. And another point they brought up is that many aftermarket valves actually have a hardened coating on them, but if you bring the valves and the head to the machine shop and you have the valves get machined, they can actually cut the hardened surface off of the valve, and it can lead to the same exact problem with the softer metal being underneath that hardened coating. Listen, I told you we have a lot to cover in this video and we are just getting started. Anyways, let's take a look at the valve seats. Now, from what I've heard from many other shops and people who've experienced this problem, is the valve seats are a harder material than the valves, and usually it's only the valve itself that's wearing out. Now, looking at these seats, it doesn't look like they are damaged. They look healthy. SPS Motorsport actually reviewed some photos of them. They said they are looking pretty good, and I probably only need to have the new valves lapped in and not get anything machined. So while I have this thing taken apart, why don't we look at every piece of the valve train and what it does. So you have the valve itself, obviously, and the valve is what's responsible for sealing the combustion into the chamber. And the valve seals against the valve seat, which is a hard ring of metal that's pressed into the head and then machined to mate up to the valve to create a good sealing surface. Inside the port, you can see this little sleeve that goes through the head. That is the valve guide. It's what keeps the valve straight. And then on the top of the valve guide, you have the valve stem seal. This is what stops the oil that's circulating in the head from being sucked down the valve via the vacuum of the combustion chamber. And when these seals go bad, your Miata will start smoking excessively, especially in vacuum or when you're coasting off throttle. And then on top of the head, you have the valve spring. This is responsible for not only holding the valve closed, but when the cam lobe opens the valve, it makes sure that the valve itself is actually following the profile of the cam and it's not able to leave the cam. If you had a valve spring that was too soft, the cam can actually fling the valve off of itself, and that's known as valve float. On top of the spring, you have the spring retainer, which holds the spring in place, but the retainer cannot do its job without the keepers. There are two halves here, and they sit in the little groove at the top of the valve, and they hold the retainer in place. Now, on top of the valve, you have the lifter, which is what sits between the valve and the cam. And then on top of the lifter, you have the shim, which controls the valve lash, or the gap between the lifter and the cam, which has to be a very specific distance. Oh yeah, and then you have these shims that sit underneath the factory valve springs, and those protect the soft aluminum of the head from being damaged by the spring, and they actually do offer a little bit of extra compression for the spring. Can you change the seat pressure by swapping these shims? Well, we're gonna find out in just a minute. But while I have all the valve train pieces sitting on the bench, why don't I weigh everything and discuss why that's important? Now, I was gonna attempt to break down the actual math and physics behind this assembly and try to calculate like how many pounds of spring pressure do you need based on RPM and all that, but of course I started getting into it and it was a little more complicated than I thought it was going to be to figure it out. But I still want to look at a basic version of the calculations just to give you guys a better understanding of why it's important to use lighter valve train parts and stiffer springs when you're revving higher, and why it gets increasingly difficult difficult the more RPM you're turning. All right, so I want to take a look at a couple equations real quick. And the first one calculates how much kinetic energy an object has based on how fast it's moving and how heavy it is. You could imagine that an object that is heavier or moving faster would take more force to stop. So in this case, the object is going to be the valve and lifter assembly, basically the whole thing that's moving. And I'm just going to use made up numbers and no units here to keep this as simple as possible. So our first example, we're just going to call stock. This would be a stock valve and lifter and spring, and we're going to spin it to 7,000 RPM. So we're just going to say that the mass is 100 and the speed at 7,000 RPM is 10. So if we math that out, we get an energy of 5,000. Now, let's say we do a shim under bucket conversion, and that reduces the Valvetrain mass by about 15%. So if we do that same math and we now have our valve assembly that's 15% lighter, we end up with a valve in motion at redline of 4,250. So by that math, we should be able to spin the engine 15% faster, right? Well, let's check it out. We can take our new Valvetrain weight of 85, and now instead of a max speed of 10 speed units, whatever you want to call it, our max speed is 11.5. And if we do the math there, we end up with 5,610, which is more than we had stock. So we've lightened the Valvetrain by 15%, but you cannot spin it 15% faster. We would have to add stiffer valve springs in this case. And this relationship is exactly why it gets harder and harder the higher the RPM gets. Once you get up to 9,000 RPM, which is only an increase of 28% over stock, the increase in the energy that valve mass has is 65% higher than stock. And the other equation I want to look at here is F equals ma. That's the amount of force something exerts based on its mass and its acceleration. So if you take a valve assembly, let's just say at 7,000 RPM, it's traveling from closed to open and its max speed is 10. And then it's got to completely reverse its speed as it's closing, and that speed is also going to be 10, assuming that the camshaft has a symmetric profile. So the total change in velocity is 20. You can call it meters per second or miles per hour or whatever you want. The change in speed is 20 speed units, and let's just say that change has to happen in 1/10 of a second. That means the change in velocity, or the acceleration, is 200 of these units per second. Now let's increase that engine redline by 10%. That means the valve is now opening at 11 speed units and it is closing at 11 speed units. So the total change is 22 speed units. So the change in velocity is greater, but not only that, since the engine is spinning 10% faster, that means the open to close event also happens 10% faster, which means that change of 22 in velocity happens in 0.09 seconds instead of 0.1 seconds, and that means the acceleration is 244 speed units per second, which is 22% greater acceleration after increasing the red line by just 10%. So if we do that same math going to 9,000 RPM, you can see the velocity change is 25.72, and that happens in 0.0714 seconds. Now that's an acceleration of 360 speed units per second, which, even though we've only increased the engine RPM by 28%, the force of that part, assuming it has the same weight as before, is 80% higher. So I'm not really sure which of these equations applies best, but I think they can both be used to show that when you increase the RPM by a certain amount, the forces exerted on the parts become exponentially greater. And that's not just for the Valvetrain. Don't forget, you also have these other reciprocating masses inside your engine called pistons, and those forces are being exerted on the rods and the crankshaft, and that's pretty much the reason why high RPM is so hard to achieve, and it wears out parts so much faster. And that's just one of the reasons why super high revving engines, like say F1 engines, are so expensive, because a lot of them are made from exotic metals that can withstand this RPM, but they still don't last very long. Anyways, I'm off my physics tangent here. Let's jump back into the head and measure what is called installed height, and that is measuring the distance between where the bottom of the spring sits and where the top of the spring sits. We're basically measuring how much the spring is compressed when it's inside of the head, and we need to measure that first before we can measure the seat pressure of these springs. Now, it's actually pretty tricky to measure the installed height of the valves in a Miata head because it's just hard to get the tools in there, so we have to do it in a couple steps. The first thing I'm going to do here is measure from the part of the head where the spring sits to the very tip of the valve stem. Really, all we have to do from here is subtract the distance from the tip of the valve stem to where the valve spring sits, but that's actually a kind of hard distance to measure as well. So what I did here is just measure from the bottom of the spring retainer to the tip, and then to calculate how tall that little step is in the valve retainer, I just put two of the retainers together and measured the distance between the spring seating surfaces and divided that by 2. Now that number right there is going to be the same across all the valves, but the distance from the tip of the valve stem to where the spring sits is not going to be the same, because oftentimes when you bring your head to the machine shop, when they do a valve job, they're not re-shimming the head, they're actually grinding the tips of the valves until your valve lash is correct, and then they just use whatever shims you brought them. And you can clearly see that here between these two different valves side by side. These valves obviously look the same when they were brand new, but one of them had to be ground down more in order to have the correct lash setting on the head. Oh yeah, and then the last thing is you have to subtract the thickness of the shim, which is 20 thousandths, from the installed height, because the spring does sit between there. You know, the shim actually compresses the spring slightly. So now I have my formula figured out. All I have to do is take that measurement from the head to the tip of the stem, and then we're gonna subtract out the distance from the bottom of the retainer to the tip of the stem, and then we're gonna add 0.153 inches, and that's the thickness of the step on the retainer minus the thickness of the spring shim, because those numbers are gonna be the same on every valve, and that's gonna give us the installed height. And I'm also interested to see the variation even between the exhaust valves, you know, the valves that didn't wear out, because this head has unknown history, and I know it lived a rough life even before I owned it, because as you can see here, at some point this part of the head actually cracked and it got re-welded and then it cracked again. So I don't really know how that happened, but I've just been rocking it and haven't really had a problem with it. So that's that. But the head could have had multiple valve jobs before I even owned it, and then I had another one done on it. And every time you cut the valves and every time you cut the seats, it increases the installed height and lowers the seat pressure. All right, so I've now measured all of my installed heights here, and I'm not really that surprised to see that there was a larger variance between the intake valves, because those are the ones that were wearing out. And not only did I measure the installed height, but I also have kept track from when the head was new how much each of the valves have moved. So valve number 7, the worst of the bunch, actually moved 23 thousandths of an inch. Over on the exhaust side, there still was a maximum variance of 21 thousandths. So although the valves had not moved due to wear, just, you know, whatever valve jobs this head has had causes that variance between the valves. And this can be compensated for with valve spring shims, but I'm about to find out how much distance actually makes a difference with my brand new broken boosted style valve spring testing rig. And again, all the tools I'm using in this video are linked down below. So what this tool consists of is a vise, a valve spring pressure tester, and a micrometer. And in a few minutes, I'll bust out the dial indicator for another test that I'm gonna do. Now, how accurate is this testing rig? I would say probably plus or minus 1 to 2 pounds. It's not going to be super precise, but I'm not building a Formula 1 engine, so it's going to get the job done and it's going to be accurate enough. So what you do here is you put your valve spring tester in the vise with the valve spring, and then you use your micrometer and you crank down the vise until the number on the micrometer matches the installed height that you had for that spring, and then you can get the seat pressure rating from the scale. So here is the data on seat pressure that I collected from the Volvo VS855 valve springs. And you can see the two most worn valves in the engine, which were number 3 and number 7 intake valves, had the lowest seat pressure. And they were affected by, it looks like 4 to 6 pounds. But those numbers really don't matter quite as much to me as looking at the exhaust side, because all of those valves are healthy. And the difference in the installed height was just due to being machined multiple times. So now I'm going to bust out the dial indicator, and we're going to set this tool up in a way that's going to measure how much the valve seat pressure changes based on normal variance between the installed heights of the valves. So I have this valve spring set up in my test rig at the loosest or the largest installed height of the exhaust side. And now what I'm going to do is crank down the vise until the spring is compressed by 21 thousandths of an inch, which represents the variance between the highest and lowest installed heights, and see how much that changes the seat pressure by. And look at that, 76 pounds of seat pressure. So that's a 7% difference in seat pressure just with normal variances in machining. So on the looser valve, what I could do is, since the factory spring shims are 20 thousandths, I could just stack two of those on top of each other and it would equal out those spring pressures. All right, I'm just editing this and I realized that I forgot to put a pretty important piece of information in here, something I learned along the way of my research that really helped me understand this concept. Okay, so you have your intake valve and it's closed. Any pressure you have inside the intake manifold is going to be pushing on the back of this valve trying to open it. So let's say you have an engine running 20 pounds of boost. Now the back of this valve is roughly 1 square inch. And now you have 20 PSI or pounds per square inch exerting that force on every part of the intake manifold, including the back of this valve. So you have 20 pounds of force acting on this valve trying to open it. If your valve spring has 70 pounds of seat pressure, effectively with that boost, you now only have 50 pounds of seat pressure. So let's say the setup on your engine requires a minimum of 76 pounds of seat pressure based on your boost and everything else. Now you get a valve job done and the installed height changes on some of those valves, and you can see a very minimal amount of change is actually going to lower that seat pressure by 6 pounds. So you can now effectively run 6 PSI less boost safely on those valves. Or if you run the boost that you were planning on running and you lose some of that spring pressure, you might have some valves that start to wear out faster than others just because of that tiny variance in machining. So anyways, I just want to include that in there because the air pressure working against the back of the valve just like helped me visualize this whole thing. So yeah, back to the video. Now, just for the heck of it, I want to check the spring stiffness when the valves are at full lift, and I'm going to use the cam that has more lift, which is the exhaust cam. Now, online, the specs are listed as 8.89 millimeters of lift. Yep, I know, I'm switching it up to metric, keeping you on your toes. Anyways, how you measure lift is first you measure the base circle, which is just this distance here from one side of the cam to the other, not factoring in the raised part of the lobe. And yeah, I know there's a machinist at home just crying right now because I'm using a caliper instead of a micrometer to measure this, but one of my friends is borrowing my mic set, so I don't have it available to me right now. But anyways, if I measure the difference between the base circle and the max lift on the cam, you can see that it is exactly 8.89 millimeters. So I'm going to set up the spring in my testing rig at the installed height, and then I'm going to crank it up to 8.89 millimeters and see how much force it applies. And there you go. At full lift, the Volvo VSS 855s produce about 165 pounds of force. And although this video is all about seat pressure, you do have to be concerned with the spring pressure at full lift, because if that number is too low, then you'll run into issues with valve float. All right, so those are all the parts that are coming out of the head, but what about the new parts going into the head? So for that, I'm gonna have to open up a very special box. All right, so I've got my new Cometic head gasket. I got a set of SuperTech intake valves, and so I had SI valves in the head before, and the only reason I got a different brand is because this is just what was in stock and ready to ship. I don't really know if these are any better or worse, but I think they're gonna get the job done just fine. I've got a set of Mazda Motorsport's shim under bucket lifters, which are not for this head, but you will see them in an upcoming video. And I've got 2 sets of the new valve springs. Oh yeah, and this other mystery box, which is full of witchcraft and shall be unveiled soon as well. Now, I'm sure everyone's gonna wanna know what springs these are, and the truth is, I don't really know. They came from a tuning shop that knows a shop that does custom cams that said, here, these are the springs you need to run. So I guess they're sort of top secret, but number one, I don't even know if these are gonna work or not, so I wouldn't even feel comfortable recommending them. But number two, I'm gonna take the measurements from these springs, so hopefully that's gonna suffice. So what you'll notice about these springs is they're actually not quite as thick, the actual rungs, but they are longer by 10 millimeters, which means they're going to be more preloaded when they are installed inside the head. And I think that's going to be the magic behind these springs. So let me throw one into my tester and see what kind of difference in seat pressure we're looking at. So we're looking at about 90 pounds of seat pressure compared to mid 70s. So I'm hoping that if seat pressure is my problem, this is going to be the solution. Now, when I crank these things up to the maximum lift of the stock cam, and they only showed 150 pounds of pressure, which was a little concerning because if you remember, the Volvo springs were 165 at max lift, But I talked to SPS Motorsport about this, and they said the main concern is the preload, is the seat pressure, and that is 90 pounds. SPS recommends a minimum of about 84 pounds of seat pressure for an application like this, so sounds like we're gonna be golden. Oh yeah, and one more thing I wanna test here. Let me just go ahead and crank up this rig to the max lift of the cams that are going into the built head for the NB. Okay, nice, 155 pounds. Well guys, it finally happened. I'm tired of taking measurements for the day, and I don't say that very often. So if you're not the type of person who loves to sit down for several hours and take tons of precise measurements, this is not the activity for you. You don't necessarily have to do all this just because you're going to build your cylinder head. I mean, pretty much any machine shop is going to be able to figure all this stuff out for you, but because I'm throwing new parts into the head, some of which I've never used before, and a lot of, which, especially with the valve springs, are not really documented yet, I want to know everything I possibly can going in, and this kind of stuff is like therapeutic for me. So hopefully you learned something about it. This is not the end of the cylinder head content by any means, but the next step for me is to get this head with the new parts to the machine shop, get it all refreshed, and get my car put back together. So if you did learn something, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe if you are new, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.